well, first of all, thank you very much for coming along and attending the AlbaCon 2020 panel for game design. For those of you who may be stumbling across us on the internet and are unsure, AlbaCon is an online charity convention where we are looking to raise some funds for phenomenal causes. This is our first year in the year, and the charity that we've picked this year is Good to Give, a charity that supports children and young people who are experiencing cancer and their families with a variety of support and opportunities for building positive memories and experiences. My name is Bob Donaldson. I'm going to be one of the co-hosts along with my co-host today, Ollie. In terms of us, I think that's all the introduction people will be interested to hear from. People will be much more interested to hear from yourselves. So if we could just go around everybody, introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourselves, that would be great. Thank you. Who'd like to go first?
This is where you point at someone.
Oh, okay.
We'll go Gareth, shall we? So, Gar, please.
I shall unmute myself and hope there was no crying child in the background for 30 seconds. I'm Gareth Hanrahan. I'm a writer and game designer. I've been working in the games industry for coming up to 2 decades, so I'm alarmingly old now. I've done loads of licensed games. I was working for Mongoose Publishing for a long time, then Cubicle 7, and now I'm mainly with Pelgrane Press. Notable things done include Darkly Mirkwood, Dracula Dossier, lots and lots of campaigns basically. And actually, considering the topic of the panel, very little game design, which may be embarrassing. We'll get to that later on.
Thank you. And Elaine, would you like to speak, please?
Yeah, I'm Elaine. I'm currently a staff writer at Cubicle 7. I've only just started in the last couple of weeks, though. So still fresh face to the writing community and everything. I'm also a producer at DigiSprite, where we do like design and everything, and that's making board games. So and also we're looking at getting into some tabletop RPG things. Worked in the video games industry for about a decade as well, doing various jobs. So I've got a weird, wide smattering of experience at this point. Currently working on Age of Sigmar Soulbound and Warhammer 40k Wrath and Glory and other games for DigiSprite. So lots of random things. No cohesive narrative right now.
Thank you. And Dave Chapman, please.
Hi, I'm Dave Chapman, as you just said. By day, I'm a retail monkey, and by night, I'm currently the line developer for Doctor Who, for Cubicle 7. I designed the Vortex system that powers it, as well as, and in the past I've worked on things like Star Trek Adventures, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Army of Darkness, things like that. I'm very, I love my licensed games, I'm afraid. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much. Steffi Devan?
Yeah, so I'm a freelance writer and developer. I've worked on Vampire the Masquerade. I've worked on Harlem Unbound, Changing the Lost, Exalted, 7C, and I also publish my own indie games. A couple of on itch.io and a couple of on Drive-Thru RPG with a partner in writing that we do a lot together. And I have a Patreon where we publish our independent games. That's me in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. And Scott Malthouse, please.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Scott Malthouse. During the day, I work in PR. Very handy with game design. And in the evenings and weekends, I do freelance game design, writing, most recently with Osprey Games for Romance of the Perilous Land. I also publish my own role-playing games and supplements through Trollish Delver Games. So Quill, letter writing role-playing game, English Eerie, which just had its edition out. And I've just written something for Against the Dark Master, which should be out hopefully soon, COVID depending.
Thank you very much. And I have the pleasure of being Bob's co-host. I'm Ollie Peltier. I'm not a designer, but we're all here for a great cause, and I'm really glad to welcome these wonderful guests. Bob.
Yeah, thanks very much for introducing yourself, everybody. That's wonderful. So I suppose one of the big things is let's get to the point about why we're here today, and that's to discuss a little bit about RPG design and the processes that's involved with that. So the first question I was thinking, just to get as a little bit of a warm-up, was to look at what it was that prompted you in the first place to start getting involved in designing games. I'll open this to everybody, and I'm sure you'll all have a variety of experiences. Scott, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I guess it's been an interest of mine for a long time, since I was probably about, 10 years old. I used to just design things, and I had a little blue notebook, and I just sit there while other kids were doing fun stuff. I was doing math and figuring out tables and things. It kind of came from there. I eventually got in with Ken St. Andre, who created Tunnels and Trolls, who kind of helped me create some modules for Tunnels and Trolls, really, because it's a very open system. It's essentially all fan created. And once I started doing that, it was just really from there. I really like world building. But also just, I think it's in part the thought of people going and people around the world potentially playing your game is quite a nice thought, a nice feeling. So I think it kind of stemmed from there. It's been there for a long time.
Great, thank you. Gar, do you want to go next?
Sure. I got into gaming, or got into writing for gaming through convention games, and which led to freelancing, which led to basically a job in the industry. So, as I said, international game design from scratch, I've done relatively little. I've always been very comfortable building on other people's stuff and taking the bones of the system, adding more to it. So most of the games that I've done has been trying to do stuff that doesn't exist anywhere else, which often means it crashes and burns horribly, because most of the easy stuff these sort of accessible stuff has been done. So beating my head off things that possibly shouldn't be games at all. But yeah, I have this sort of private theory that you could do almost anything with sort of basic D&D in the first place. Everything else just sort of variations on that. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant, thank you. Steffi, how about yourself? What was your experience? What brought you and got you involved into designing games?
Well, I initially simply answered one of the writers' submissions for Onyx Path Publishing, and they hired me. They liked what I did. And I've worked for several companies on existing going lines. But there was always that itch, I had ideas and I want to work on them. So eventually I started a Patreon with Elizabeth Chapman, who owns her own company called Angry Hamster Publishing. And we just started writing 12 games in 12 months, which in hindsight we did, but it was not the best idea I've ever had. It was actually, we published them in this book. But yeah, so that was when I really started to, I can, do it completely on my own from scratch. But before that, I worked for several companies and work within a larger framework, which I do enjoy and I'm very good at it. But it was fun to just do something that was completely mine.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Dave, how about yourself? How did you get involved into starting to design games?
I'm going to show my age now, because I was a very hardcore gamer in the mid 80s, and I had that usual frustration when Indiana Jones RPG, there's no character creation rules in the basic box set, so I was very, very keen on working out how all that kind of worked. And then I had this memory of reading Ghostbusters, the West End Games one, and reading that and thinking, God, this is so much fun to read. Somebody has got paid to write this, and I bet they had a real blast doing it. So I wrote a couple of scenarios for it on the old electric typewriter and mailed them off to New York, and waited the 3 months for a response, as you'd expect. And of course, didn't go anywhere, but I got a very nice letter back. I remember I think it was from Greg Kostick again, and said, yeah, we can't use this because you've used food gods like before, and you've used like celebrities like Bruce Willis and Scooby-Doo and things like that. We can't publish this, but you can write. And that has always stuck in my head. Although I went on to do other things, I tried getting into comic publishing for a while, and that kind of got me talking to Eden Studios, because I was going to try and do a Conspiracy X comic, and it kind of escalated from there. Just got talking to George Vasilikos over at Eden, and managed to put my foot in the door there, and worked on Buffy, All Flesh Must Be Eaten, and then on to Conspiracy X 2.0.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much for that. And last but certainly not least, Elaine, what was your experiences? How did you kind of get into starting to design games?
It's a weird one, I guess. So being big into like tabletop games, Games Workshop, things like that growing up, and also my mother, enormous nerd, probably a bigger nerd than I am. She speaks Klingon. So I remember at a young age finding this treasure trove of like these old pulp fiction, like science fiction fantasy novels and all this kind of stuff. And that was like my first introduction. And then my mother used to do like tabletop, like Napoleonic Wars, things like that. So she was painting miniatures and stuff. So I picked a lot of that up from her. And then I loved games so much, I ended up going to study at Abertay University. I studied games design there. And that was mostly focused on video games. And that was the original goal I had in mind, was because obviously video games were the big shiny thing. And I remember playing all these stories and things like that and being like, oh my gosh, like video games are the future. Video games are great. So studied games design at Abertay, graduated smack bang on the recession. So that was cool. So I worked in oil and gas for a few years out of university. And then I ended up working a mobile games company, working on like Angry Birds and weird licenses like that. And then I left there. I worked as a producer in another company. I bounced around lots of different roles. And then I just, the more you work, or the more I worked in video games, the more I realized that I really just wanted to be telling stories. I really wanted like to have as little barrier for entry as possible. I always sort of say when you're designing something like a board game or a card game or something, and you're like, okay, draw 2 cards. You can write that on a piece of paper and someone can do that. But then the instant you try to digitize that, it's like, okay, that'll be 2 months. So we can get a card drawing engine and rendering everything and graphics and stuff. So my partner, Robin, she was making digital card games. And she was having trouble with those things, and we sat down and ended up making paper prototypes for things, and then that was, oh my god, we should just make board games and card games. So then we started making board and card games in our spare time. At the same time, I got a game design job working for like a weird Californian company, and that was like I was their on-staff game designer. And a dungeon master, so I ran games for people that was in the company, which is probably the weirdest job I've ever had. It's like for almost 2 years, being a dungeon master for this remote company of Californians, which was crazy. And then in my spare time, I was starting to try and get some freelance work, and that was when I got I stumbled upon the open call at Cubicle 7, and that was Emmett at Cubicle 7 and whatnot. They were looking for writers to come on to write for Age of Sigmar Soulbound when that was launching, and I ended up landing work there and writing the free starter adventure, which is online now and things like that. And then I've been working with them freelance for a while, and then they offered for me to come on full time as of a couple of weeks ago. So it's been this weird bouncing around, always like trying different things until eventually working my way to where I am here. So it's always a nightmare whenever I have to. Someone's like, "So how did you get into this?" I'm like, "Ah." So there we go. That's how I got where I am just now. A very strange, bumbling path.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. I think one of the things that I find really interesting there is for every single member of the panel has a slightly different story of how they got involved and how they started in game design, which I find really, really interesting. Speaking of starts, I suppose that brings me to the next question. I think for this one, if we just, people kind of feel free to chip in and answer where they would like. So you're designing an RPG. For you, what is your starting point? Where do you begin the process?
I always start with a theme and a mood. Like, I've got the concept, but then I want to know what the mood of the game is and what the theme of the game is. Because once you start working for me, I tend to go on tangents. And then I can just, does it fit the mood? Yes, it can stay. No, it can't stay. It's great, but it needs to go. So I always start with what are my themes and what's the mood that I want to convey with the game. And then I go from there.
That's brilliant. Thank you. That's anyone else?
I always start off ask like, what are the characters doing in the game? Who are the characters? What sort of things do you play? What is like game session 17 of a campaign? What are you doing in that session? Could be it's easy enough to basically to do a one shot of a game, but for a role playing game, it has to be able to support like multiple sessions or multiple iterations of the same game without being super repetitive. So basically, try to work out what the players will do over the course of a long series of games.
I'd have to join in on that one. The biggest problem, I've been working on one game called Wild for a long time, which is like a thing on DreamShare, and I've been working on it for about 8 years. And my problem is I had all this setting and how the tech works and what happens in it and all that kind of things, but I never had the what do you do? And that's possibly why it's taken me 8 years to get there. It's only within the last few months that I've sort of, what do they actually do when they use this technology and stuff? And it's that, and now I've actually got that. It's that things are starting to come together. I wish I'd known that like 8 years ago. It would have been saved so much time. Okay.
The way I try to look at it whenever starting on a new design is I find you can roughly categorize your designs as either bottom up or top down. So if like Steffi, you've got like a theme, you're like, okay, I want Edwardian era vampire noble drama, and you've got like a theme and stuff, and then you start, okay, here's characters, here's the type of things we're going to do, but then how do we do this? What does a character sheet look like? What are the mechanics? And then you filter it down, like top down, from theme to mechanics. Or the other way is if you're like, okay, cool, so I've got this really cool idea for a mechanic, like I want a tabletop RPG where all the combat is resolved through JRPG turn-based combat. I want characters to line up in 2 rows and attack each other. That's the mechanic. But what is the world? What is the themes? So you're sort of starting mechanics and working up. A lot of the time, it's a bit messier than that. So you'll have like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, and things like that. But I find that that's kind of like the 2 ways I can categorize my own designs. It's like I either have a great theme or I have a great mechanic, and it's kind of building in the opposite direction from that is my personal workflow for it.
Yeah, I think I'm very much like that. I don't really have a specific starting point. It just depends on what in my head at any one point. It could be top down, it could be bottom up. With Quill, that's about, well, how it's more of a challenge. So sometimes I'll come at it as, okay, well, what could be a really difficult thing to get across, and how could I do that? Which is how quite a few of my kind of games have started. And sometimes it is that feel and mood. It could be I tend to get, if I've been traveling somewhere, or staying in, whether it's the Lake District and the countryside there, I might be inspired by that to, okay, well, I have a world here, or I have a feeling or a mood. But sometimes it could be, okay, actually, this mechanic that I've seen here is really nice. How could I use that, or how could I expand on something like that? And what does that actually make at the end of it? So it's, I'm very much the same. Kind of, there's no real starting point, the same starting point for any of my designs.
That's great, thanks. One of the things that I noticed that quite a few people mentioned there was the idea of starting off with a feeling or a mood or a theme. And Steffi, you kind of mentioned that sometimes you could find yourself kind of moving off tangent a little bit. What kind of things is it that you maybe put in place to ensure that your game really represents the themes and the kind of tones that you're trying to invoke? Is there anything in particular that you try to employ, any strategies that you'd like to talk about?
I don't have an elaborate strategy, but I do like to make mood boards for my indie games. I don't do it for freelancer games. I'm like, I've got the mood board because it's what they tell me. But for my own games, I like to pick up images that make me go, yeah, that's what I want it to be like. And I just slap those together. And there's also help in terms of inspiration. I'll look at it and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
For me, I think focusing on how the players are rewarded. If the tone of the game is going to be rewarding vampires, so if it's on intrigue and romance, then you get XP for engaging in intrigue and romance. Either a list of achievements you can unlock to seduce the heiress, get an experience point. Defeat a foe through some elaborate intrigue, get an experience point or something. Foreground what the players are supposed to do, thematically and tonally, and basically mechanize that.
If I'm designing a system from scratch, like a game or even like a sometimes if it's a very elaborate adventure. But it's a system stolen from software development. It's called a mush cow analysis, and essentially it's one of the first documents you make when you're starting on a project, and you break it down into sections which are what the game must have, what it should have, what it could have, and what it won't have, and that's you sort of sit down with your team and you're like, okay, the game must have these things. So say you're wanting to do a very realistic, crunchy system. You can say it must have complicated critical hit tables. This is a selling point for the game, that we want to be big. And then you can have things it should have. So it should have maybe a nice big war gear section. Then it could have, so maybe it can have vehicles or whatnot. And then things it won't have. So it won't have fluffy social rules, none of that. This game's about shooting mans with guns and exploding heads or whatever, so we're not putting that in there. And then it's a living document, so as you're developing your game, you can always refer back to this document. So if somebody is starting to feel like they're losing track of what the game is or whatever, they can go back to the mush cow and they can say, okay, no, it's not on there. And it also works for prioritization, so you make sure that the things that are in your must category are locked in, they're good, they're solid, they're the core focus, and your should haves are secondary, they should still be solid, and then your could haves are opportunities to expand on things. So that's kind of the core design document that I like to, or it's part of a core design document which I like to refer back to make sure I'm not suddenly wildly careening, because especially when you're working on a project like a big game or something. So some a one-page RPG, you could sit down with lightning in a bottle and fire out overnight and have a beautiful little one-page RPG that gives a unique ambience or mechanic or something. But when you're working on a big chunky boy, a system, it could take 18 months to develop this thing, and it's so easy for like the world to change, or for you to change, and for new media to come in and change your interests. And suddenly, if you don't make sure that this project you started 18 months ago is still the vision you're trying to finish, you could end up with just this perpetually changing system that ends up as a big, horrendous mess. So yes, Mushka. That's my personal, and it's also got a fun name.
I worked on some computer games which have just like, wandered off into, we could do this, 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 and then it's like 2 years later and all the money is gone.
Yeah, that's why you need producers in more competent producers in your video games industry. Crunch is bad, okay? No crunch. Unionize. There we go. That's my divergent into video games politics for a split second there. Back on track.
Yeah, I mean, my process is certainly not that structured. It probably should be, to be honest. But I tend to note down what are the kind of the few core philosophies of what I'm looking for. Am I looking to create a game that is going to be great for newbies to jump on board? Maybe they've been playing D&D, and I want them to think, okay, can I get them on board with my game by having something similar but different? It could be, do I want it to be super flexible, or do I want it to have a lot of GM fiat, or make it for more experienced GMs? And I tend to have a document that just has these few philosophies down on it, and I will just skip between them. And I think I'm, a little bit more chaotic. Things flying around. And eventually I get to some point that I'm happy with after the 500 philosophies I've gone through.
It's like the two ends of the spectrum. Regimented, documents, systems, and just throw things at a wall and see what sticks.
Really strange. In my day job, I'm very regimented in systems, and then when it comes to game design, it's like, just go with the flow.
There's no right or wrong way to do it, I guess, is kind of the key thing, is that you can still, you can always still make things regardless of your own personal, whatever gets the job done. They say that just with writing in general and fiction, is that you can spend your entire life looking at how other writers write. And, Roald Dahl does this, Stephen King does this, all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it's over a course of time just finding what works for you. I think is kind of the best advice I could give to anyone who's looking to get into game design, is just experiment with different methods of designing and organizing, starting, finishing projects.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So yeah, it's really quite interesting just to see, once again, different approaches and styles to looking at the same idea for designing, and looking at where you start off with. One of the things that I've always really been curious as a long-term gamer is, you've got your themes and tones, and that's for planning what you want to get out of this game. One of the most direct ways to look about doing that is through this potentially the setting and the environment that the game is held in. So I suppose one of the things I'm wondering next is how you go about integrating the setting with mechanics. Is there a particular process involved with that you could talk about? Tell us a little bit about.
I keep going first. Somebody else go first.
I keep talking a lot, so someone else talk a lot.
Okay, fine.
Dave, I nominate you.
Okay. I guess the thing is trying to reflect the setting as best possible, and I think the thing that stuck in my head when I started working on Doctor Who was actually Buffy. CJ Carella did a really good job with the working mechanics for the system for Buffy to try and make it reflect what you see on TV. So like the standard episode of Buffy, whenever she goes into a fight, she beats up some vampires for a bit. There's a fist fight, a bit of kicking, and then she stakes them. And CJ Corella came up with this great idea for the way the game system works, is that it's very hand-to-hand combat, but you kind of had to whittle down the vampire's strength before you could stake them and dispatch them. And it was just something little like that really kind of makes the game mechanics feel like what you see on the TV. And I kind of, that was always a big inspiration for me, especially when I started working on the Doctor Who one, because it was a case of watching a lot of Doctor Who and trying to emulate what you see on screen. And a lot of what you see on screen is an absence of combat on the Doctor's side and being able to talk your way out of a situation. So I think that was the thing that I tried to get into the Who game, was trying to make combat less of a regular thing and something that's really, really dangerous if you do get into it. But the people who talk their way out of things get to go first, so they get a chance to sort of calm everything down before it all gets to the laser blasts and the little X-ray skeletons on screen.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if we're sort of talking about sort of like fairly conventional design as opposed to like, you know, sort of ultra indie stuff, then one of the things to always keep in mind is just terminology. That, I mean, in any role-playing game, you know, sort of like your conventional Gygaxian role-playing game, the player characters will be like, you know, they'll be hitting things, they'll be picking locks, they're going to be exploring stuff, they'll be looking at things, they're going to be opening books and so forth. You can convey a lot about the setting just by like the way you name different abilities and different stats and so forth. One of the best like, you know, like mechanical design ever is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's Small but Vicious Dog on the cover sheet. Just, it says so much about the setting, but the feel of the game in, you know, one fragment of equipment list. But yeah, just look at the words you're using for your design and like, to match the vocabulary to the setting.
Quite like systems that, especially if it's a really narrative system, systems that the actions that players can do are very descriptive. So, like you're sort of saying with like a sort of Gygaxian D&D, Savage Worlds, all these other kind of like systems, it's a case of you have your character sheet, here's your abilities, and you use those to interact with the world, which is kind of the thing I always try to keep in mind. It's like whatever the player has in front of them and whatever the actions they have available is how they interact with the world. So it's kind of like reverse engineering rather than how does the world infer mechanics. It's kind of more like what abilities does a player have, what sort of like character abilities and actions can they take. So if you look at something like say Powered by the Apocalypse, there's action in that. It's just kick some ass. You're gonna go kick some ass, or you're gonna investigate. And rather than saying to the GM, okay, I'm playing Vampire the Masquerade or something, you say I have these stats, and you say to the GM, I would like to do X, and then the GM says, okay, what stats do you have, and roll this. With something like that, it feels like the setting is tied very closely because you can say, I would like to kick some ass, and then you roll to kick some ass, and that's it, rather than having to create a sort of social contract between GM and player. So I quite like systems that do that. But those systems tend to, the more specific you make the actions, the more specific the tone and the experience you're generating. Something like, for example, say, I'm trying to think, say The Quiet Year, which is it's like a map. This is not my name, so I was talking about it on Twitter. But it's a really lovely indie game by is it Avery Adler? And it's a map making game, and the game is about recovering a civilization or like a settlement after a war, and your interactions are all about drawing on a map. And you're slowly, with you and your friends, you're drawing landmarks and resources and things like that. So that these are the actions that your player has, and because you're physically drawing on a map, it's telling you so much about the setting and the themes of the game, just because you are literally trying to build this together. And I'm sure Quill has some very cool stuff in there as well, like that.
Yeah, well, it's penmanship and language. Yeah, I agree. I mean, look at games like 316, Carnage Amongst the Stars, where you essentially two stats, which are it's pretty much fighting and not fighting, isn't it? Which immediately shows you will be doing more of in that game. War game. So yeah, I totally agree with that. It's how you're kind of baking those mechanics and helping them reflect what your theme is and what the overall mood is, and how that story is told as well. Not necessarily just the world, but how do people tell those stories? If you're writing a horror game, then you might want to be reflecting how a horror story is paced, as opposed to, say, a dungeon game where you're kicking down doors and things like that, or a full-on kind of action game, or yeah.
You reminded me of Lasers and Feelings, which is another excellent one-page RPG where the only two stats are lasers or feelings, and it's Star Trek, Star Wars-esque, and it's another good one to break out.
So what I like to do is just connect the mechanics specifically to what the game is supposed to do. So I recently wrote a game. It's called Whites, where you play the descendants of Witte Wieven, which is a Dutch legend about these mist women who protect women from bad men. And you're the descendants of them. So you've got this sliding scale. Part of it is protection, the need that you feel to protect people, and the other part is vengeance, is the need that you feel to punish the wicked. And that's one of those balancing scales where you can only have a certain amount of points between them. So you can never max them both. It's one or the other. So I like doing that in character creation, but I also like tailoring the mechanics to simply how lethal a game should be. Like Scott mentioned horror games, and I wrote one last year called We Die Here, and as the name implies, it's not about the longevity and happiness of your characters. And I specifically wrote the mechanics to be deadly. So there's a lot of stuff that you don't have to roll for. It's fine, you don't have to roll. But the moment you start rolling dice, you're going to get in trouble, because the dice are specifically, they're going to be against you, because I wrote the system to just be very, very nasty, because that is the feeling I wanted to invoke with that particular game.
Thank you, that was excellent. They're all excellent. That's an excellent game as well. It's like I've been trying to track it down. So it's Bob.
I suppose for me, kind of a little bit of a follow-on for that is one of the things I'm always really quite curious about when we kind of talk about mechanics, is if there's particular systems that people prefer to use when they're writing, or even is there a mechanic that you are in particular really proud of developing yourself?
Go ahead.
Oh, Gareth, no, go for it.
No, I mean, most of my work these days is like for various companies, so I'm like their internal systems. So at the moment, I have my head deep inside Gumshoe, which is a very a great system for investigation, and it is a very sort of clear example of game design, because it sort of captures a lot of what we talked about here, and also shows how one system can be adapted to different settings and tweaked in different ways. In terms of stuff I'm very proud of, more for how I solved it than I think it accomplished on its own. But I was doing this licensed game based on the Primeval TV series, which is honestly justly forgotten. using the Vortex system, which Dave designed for Doctor Who. And Primeval is basically about these magic portal, or these science fiction portals that are bringing historical monsters, mainly dinosaurs, into the present day. So, which made it tricky for a role-playing game because the bad guys were, for the most part, dumb dinosaurs who you can't have a conversation with. At the same time, they're not necessarily hostile because they're basically just animals. So I had to design a little subsystem which made ordinary animals effectively a threat in the modern day, but also let players deal with it in a way that wasn't just shoot them dead. You could sort of calm them down. You could basically made animal handling the central combat mechanic. And I was able to tie that into how the creature's abilities worked. So basically, if a Tyrannosaurus got angry and angry, it would get more fury points or anger points, whatever I call them, and would start roaring at you and biting you. Whereas if you calmed it down sufficiently, it wouldn't attack you. So basically, an example of you come up with some sort of setting problem, in this case, making dinosaurs interesting, and try and solve it mechanically. Anyway, Starter, really interrupted you.
No, that's a great example. I think for me, probably the English eerie kind of pacing system with cards, because it's based around kind of English folk stories, but also stories by Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, horror writers who have a very very precise kind of pacing in the stories. That tension is just ratcheted up as it goes through, and I wanted to reflect that in a way that I guess isn't necessarily out there in games like Call of Cthulhu, where it's slightly different. So I went for a mechanism where it's you're dealing cards and you're overcoming obstacles with those cards, and every time you get a Grey Lady card, the tension ratchets up. Something else happens to help that tension ratchet up, and then the mechanics change, or everything gets harder to do. So what happens is, as you're going through it, the story gets away from the narrator to a point where they are, I guess, similar to Steffi, what you were talking about before. It was created so that it's probably going to end badly, because it should end badly. And that's baked into that kind of card system. So I'm quite proud of how that turned out and how that works.
Yeah, and tying into card systems, so I think of the games that I designed, I think We Die Here has the most solid, best tested mechanic. It's very, very character driven. It's very intense and personal and highly lethal. But one of the systems that I had the most fun with was actually the first indie game that I wrote. It's called Return to Wonderland, and it's about Alice and her companions who fled into London in, 1870 something. They're trying to build a life there, but the tyrant, one of the bad creatures of Wonderland, who has taken over all of Wonderland, comes into London to harass them, and then they need to go back. And it's one of those, I'm an anti-capitalist, so it's one of those games like, you have to hold down a job, you have to pay your fucking rent, and also someone's trying to kill you, and you've got to prioritize between those. And then they go back. But anyway, so I decided, because it was a Wonderland game, I was like, so my mechanics have to be either a chessboard or a deck of standard playing cards. Let me tell you, designing a game around a chessboard is fucking hard. I couldn't do it. Am I allowed to swear? It's hard. I couldn't do it. So you play it with a standard deck of cards, and it's a lot of fun. And the cards change depending on which of the characters you play. So the Mad Hatter uses different rules than Alice. And also on what tyrant you choose, like the Jabberwocky or the Walrus and the Carpenter. Or the White Queen or the Red Queen, and then the mechanics change slightly, but it's a standard game of cards, and it's a lot of fun. It's a little weird, but it's a lot of fun. That's the good part about indie games, is you can kind of write stuff that's weird, and people are like, okay.
was amazing. What did you say that was?
Return to Wonderland?
Return to Wonderland.
Speaking of anti-capitalist sentiments and designing fun mechanics, we are currently working on DigiSprite, a tabletop role-playing game set in we made a card game called Adventure Mart, and it's essentially, if you imagine Animal Crossing 7-Eleven, so it's all anthropomorphized cute animals stuck in capitalistic hell. So they're all, and the idea is it's like this multi-dimensional chain of convenience stores. So you have all of these wonderful fantasy creatures, and they're all having to pay the rent and things like that, and work in these 7-Elevens. And our tagline for it is the customer's always right and the rent is always due. So I wanted from the ground up to build a game that had no sort of conflict was never going to be the answer, because at the end of the day, if you're going to blow up and attack a customer who comes in and complains, that's like a game over state at that point. So we also we've been working with playing cards, and there's essentially 4 different ways. We have the games master either picks a card or draws a card, and that's the problem. So we like to think of it like a sort of a slice of life game. So if you're used to watching like sitcoms or slice of life anime or whatever, it's these little vignettes, these scenes, and it'll be, okay, here's a problem. And it can be a financial problem, it can be a physical problem, an intellectual problem, or an emotional problem. And then the players themselves have to also draw 2 cards and try to overcome the problem using one of those 4 abilities. So for example, you might have a lost child shows up in the store, and it's here's a 5 of hearts. It's an emotional problem. You need to try and calm this child down because the other customers are getting annoyed at this crying child. So the person has to draw their own things, and it's all about that. Like one of the core themes is about making the best of what you've got, because it's like you are sort of trapped in this cycle, and you've just got to do the best you can with what you have. So you draw these 2 cards, and you're like, okay, well, all I have is I can either solve this financially or intelligently. So what do I do here? So you would maybe use some of your own money to buy the child a sweet or a toy or something to get them to calm down, or maybe you would tell them a riddle or do something like that. But also, if you can't pass a test, you can always successfully fail. So you can say, I just want to fail. I just want to succeed here. I just want to do it. But then the games master can essentially give you like sort of a debuff that they can cash in later to make something more difficult. So again, it's about this sort of just making the best of what you have. So I've been enjoying designing that a lot. It's very fun going from systems like set in the Warhammer universes where everything is shoot the mans with the guns or cut the demons with the swords and everything, to suddenly switch paddles and be like, okay, cool. So how do we deal with a crying child in the convenience store? And I love that mix so much.
Yeah, and I love the mechanic of successfully failing. I always call it fail forward. Like, well, you solved this problem. However, you did that by opening a gate to hell. So let's focus on that now. So yeah, failing forward is just one of my favorite mechanisms ever. I also love it when players do that. They're like, can I do that? It's a phenomenally bad idea, so yes.
With Adventure Mart, it's much more, the example for fail forward things I used was, the slushy machine's broken. The mana slushy machine is broken, and the Mages Guild are all angry. You got to fix the thing, so they failed their test, so they decide to kick it, and it breaks their foot. Rather than opening a portal to hell. Smaller stakes, but same concept.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I suppose that moves quite nicely on to my next question. So you're working on a project, and you're looking to use an already established or in-house system or mechanic. How do you kind of go about ensuring that really matches the game and the style that you're trying to create? And are there any kind of positives or challenges really when you're trying to refine something that's already used elsewhere?
So I do a lot of writing for systems that other people designed, and I found that you read the book and you read the system. That's step one. Don't skip that. But my secret is printing a character sheet, because it immediately jogged my memory. Oh yeah, that's what perception in this game look like. Oh yeah, that's what they do for athletics in this game. So printing it, because I switch a lot between different game systems. I always forget what the system is like the moment I stop writing. I've got one of those brains like I can only remember what I'm doing now. But I print a character sheet and I put it next to my computer while I write for that specific game line, and it works wonders. At least it does for me.
I do the same thing with GM screens. If the system has a games master screen or something like that, I like to use that because it tends to have all like your skills and difficulty levels and things like that. If you're...
I don't. I've only really worked on a couple of games that are from other publishers, but it's anything that's in a quick start or anything that's kind of in a cheat sheet is generally the stuff that is the most important. It's the stuff that the designers want to forefront. So as long as I'm getting that into the game, into the adventure, but also I guess making sure that I'm getting the feel of and the mood right of the setting of the game, and not going too far from it, because I tend to have my own style in the way that I write, but obviously sometimes that doesn't mesh with whatever setting you're with. You know, people are going to hire you because they want your voice, because they want you to write for them, but at the same time you've kind of got to. Well, I found that you kind of got to balance that between what your natural voice is.
I had the weird bit where I was taken on as line developer in the early stages for Star Trek Adventures for Modiphius, and they wanted to use their 2D20 system. So it was a case of what John Carter looks like, his Conan and things like that. Here's the game system. Now make it work for Star Trek. And it's one of those strange moments where you get that bit. It was just how much can you take a game system apart and rework it so it works for something else. And that the weird bit was the conversation I had with Chris at Modiphius. It was that all the 2D20 games, the stats are connected to the skills. So what if I cut them off and you could use any stat with any skill? And I think that was the thing that is that don't be afraid to sort of try and push it and break the system down to its very basics. But that was good fun. It's a shame I didn't have enough time to keep staying on that system.
Yeah, I mean, the first point is really identifying what the strengths and weaknesses of the system you're working with is. What is it good at? What sort of games can support easily? What sort of games does require a bit of work to support? And also what kind of games does not sing for it all? And you should push back on the assignment, or basically are you sure? We were working on D20 stuff back in the boom when everything went to D20, and there were many games there where that was a horrible mistake. Obviously, know what the game is strong at and build on that, which can mean as well sort of taking bits of the setting that you weren't initially going to focus on, sort of pushing those forward more, because they sort of resonate in a game perspective more than they do from a fictional perspective.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about writing adventures and things like that as well for an established company, ideally they should have a style guide.
Oh my god, yes, please do.
Please,
as a freelancer, yes, give me your style guide.
Yes, freelancing, it's when you're bouncing between multiple projects, please give us style guides, because even things like the language used, terminologies, strange things like, oh, in this setting, this word is always capitalized, or general, like it saves freelancers and it saves editors a heck ton of time. So please make those and keep them up to date.
And like you said, a capitalization guide, please.
Mm-hmm. And I also quite like pronunciation guides if you can do them.
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah, and I've worked for a couple of companies who didn't have a style guide and genuinely didn't mind how I handled it in. It was fine, like Google Docs, whatever. So in that case, okay, then I don't need a style guide if you genuinely don't mind. But don't put me in the position where you don't give me a style guide and then you look at my stuff and you're like, oh yeah, wait, I do mind. Just tell me up front.
Yeah, it's not very good.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much for that. I suppose that moves quite nicely on with some of the things that you were saying, Dave, to my next question, which was about game design and use of licensed products. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I was wondering about with that was when working with a licensed product, really, where do you start with that? Is it a different setup that you use when working with licensed products? And the other side is there any added complexities that's involved when you're working with licensed property?
It's the wonders of approvals, I think, is going to be the thing that's going to slow you down on that one. When you're working with a licensed one, it's a case where you'll get everything finished and the publishers are even happy with it, but then it's got to go to the people who own the property to have a look at, and that can take from weeks to months, which does slow things down. Sometimes you're lucky. The Beeb have been very good with Doctor Who. I remember Fox were pretty good with Buffy as well. There was a moment when we were writing the Slayer's Handbook for Buffy, and we were writing up the stats for Faith and Kendra, and neither of them had last names. They're not mentioned in the series at all. And so we contacted Fox and just said, look, they haven't got names. What do we call them in the book? And they immediately called Joss Whedon, and Joss Whedon came back with the names for them because it plucked out of the air somewhere. But yes, and I must admit, working with the Beeb at the moment on Doctor Who, this ridiculously fast at the moment, which is unheard of for working on a licensed property. I mean, I've been sending emails off going, so what's the current status of Unit? And it's been I've been getting emails back within a day, and it's been great, but don't expect it to be like that all the time.
You just jinxed it.
I've ruined everything now. Just as I'm about to send them the new core book as well, and it's that, oh God, it's going to be another 8 months now.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so I developed one licensed game for Onyx Path Publishing. We licensed the Legend Lore IP from the Legend Lore people. So it's a comic from the 80s, I want to say. But anyway, so it's a portal isekai game. You cross into the realm and you have these fabulous adventures. The thing is, it's a comic written in the 80s. I've read all of it back to back, and a lot of it is great, and a lot of it made me go, huh. So one of the first things I asked the license holders was like, how much can I change to just put a couple of more women in there? Like maybe some black people, maybe some transgender people, pansexuals, aromantics. And they were like, go ahead. So that was actually pretty swell that I was like, yeah, I like the comics, but, everybody looks to be cis-het, and can we make them not? And they were completely supportive. So that was actually my only experience with a licensed game, and it was pretty fabulous.
I mean, I've done a bunch of licensed games for various people. The first step I find is basically work out if what you're dealing with is a setting or a story. Because if you're doing it based on like a series of books or a TV show or something, then you basically work out how much of the property is bound up in the tale of these particular characters and this particular series of events, and how much can be extracted out into a gameable setting. And it's possible, basically, if things like super bound to those characters, you need to make the game about them or people like them. If it's like can be sort of extrapolated out to be a wider setting, then you can go, okay, what else can people be doing in the setting? Like for example, in Lord of the Rings, you've got basically all of Middle Earth, but a lot of Middle Earth is already very likely sketched in places, and a lot of these the elements that aren't in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are outside the bounds of any license. So be very careful. But at the same time, you don't want to basically just create the game where you basically play to against Lord of the Rings, because if you read that, they know what's going to happen there, and you're not going to match the experience of reading the books. So you just sort of find the corners of the setting where there's enough detail that you don't make stuff out of whole cloth, but there's enough sort of free space that you can add in your own stuff. There's enough adventures that players feel that they're doing something of importance and note, but not that's going to tread on the events or the events of canon. So a lot of working license games is finding something little niche where you can put in the actual stuff for the players to do. And then of course you got Doctor Who, which is basically oh look, new planet of the week.
Yeah, I actually think Doctor Who handles this very well, because you've got 4 to 6 players, but only one of them can be the Doctor, and I actually think I think Doctor Who handles that well, that everyone's got something to do.
I think from my, and again, admittedly, this is only a little bit of experience from freelancing over the last while, Cubicle 7 and everything. But I definitely feel like with the licensed materials, you just need to go in prepared to be a little bit less precious about your ideas, because you never know at any point, like Dave was saying during the approval process, you never know if the license holder is going to say, actually, could you change the arc of the story or the setting or the characters involved, or anything could sort of change at any time. So sort of getting into that mindset when you're working on someone else's licenses, that you're playing with someone else's toys, I guess is what I try to think of. And at any point they could say you're doing it wrong, and you've just got to be like, okay, cool, that's no problem. I'll change that. And obviously there's only so much. You don't want to get into a relationship with a license holder where it's constant, and you're being taken for a ride. Luckily enough, I've not experienced that. But I'm sure there's some people out there who must have some horror stories. But yeah, not being too precious of your work, being flexible is probably the key sort of thing to ramp into when you're preparing to write for a licensed thing or use a licensed system or anything like that.
There's a huge difference between licenses between ones that are under active development by other people and ones that are sort of safe and ossified. Tolkien is not going to suddenly pop and go, aha! Did I mention this other Gondor? But if you're dealing with a series of novels or Star Trek or something where there's still elements that are partly being developed, you can run into horrible situations where you just done a book on the history of the Federation or something, and they turn on the TV and goes, oh, they just changed all that. And especially with big licenses, if you're the roleplay license, you're at the very much at the bottom of the chain in terms of being told about developments. I'm sure with Doctor Who, you're not getting advanced notes of scripts, but
that only happened once, and it was marvelous, but it only happened the once. There was a moment just before Matt Smith's first series where they actually let us read the scripts of the whole series before it aired. And Dom from Cubicle 7 and I, we both went to BBC in London, and we were put in a room. We weren't allowed to take our phones in with us. We were allowed to make notes, and we had one day to read all 13 of the scripts, and we weren't allowed to leave. But it was great because we were sat there reading them, and yeah, I can't talk about this. Oh my God. But yeah, it was fantastic. But
yeah, that's a really cool story. Just being able to go in and pre-read all the Doctor Who stuff. Oh, ever so slightly jealous. It's pretty awesome. So yeah, thanks very much for that. That's given a really interesting insight into working with licensed products. I suppose one of the other things I'm a little bit curious about is, so you've worked on a project, you've designed some mechanics, you've maybe worked on set and scene. I suppose my next thought is about playtesting. So playtesting is often considered as a key component for any kind of design and testing process. What lessons have you learned or experiences have you got through playtesting, and how do you know when you've got to the point where you've done enough playtesting?
Can never do enough playtesting.
Yeah, no, never enough. But I would say that you do want to tell your playtesters what you're aiming for. Like I said, We Die Here is super lethal. It's supposed to be lethal. And I don't need people telling me, oh, we all died. I know you were supposed to. So you do want to give your playtesters some instructions, like this is what I wanted to do. Tell me if it does. Because if it wasn't lethal, then I would have wanted people to tell me we didn't die, and I would go, okay, fine, I need to up the stakes. Obviously, this game doesn't work. So that give them instructions, tell them what you want the system to do, and ask them if it does. And also the thing that I would say is, don't let the person who wrote it playtest that area. Like if you're designing a big book, you'll have a couple of freelancers writing different parts of the system, and often the freelancers are very excited and they want to help playtest. But if they playtest their own system, you're going to run across the problem that they know how they intended for it to work, and they'll read it that way, whereas somebody who didn't write it would be like, I have no idea what this means. And you want that feedback. So yeah, give them specific instructions, and don't let people test their own stuff. And then just keep testing until it's time to put it to bed. At one point, you've got to put the game out. That's it.
I do. I do think there's, and this is maybe coming from a lot of board game testing and video game testing as well. I do think there is some value in essentially sitting a bunch of strangers in a room together and dropping a box and then walking out and seeing what happens as well. Like, definitely, I think you need a bit of both. Would be my own take on it, is that you do need, you want to sort of say to people and prepare them beforehand and say, this is the type of thing, this is how it's going to work. But you can get some very interesting experiences when you think everything is really clear, because obviously with any game, once it eventually reaches its final stage, there's not going to be a designer or a writer around to ask questions or explain or sort of like warm the group up or anything. So some of the most fun sort of playtesting experiences I have had have just been, hello, random group of disparate souls. Here's a game. I'm just going to sit in the corner. Don't look at me. Don't talk to me. I'm not here. And then you just sit there and you just see what happens. And are all the instructions clear? Does it actually flow? Does it work? Or do you find people are missing entire mechanics or entire thematic conceits or whatever? So yeah, I think both are good.
I mean, playtesting RPGs is weird because, like, unlike pretty much any other form of game, you write your text, it then gets handed to another person to interpret. Like with a board game or computer game or something, you sort of have control, like, this is how the game plays. People may respond differently, but everyone will play the same game. With a role-playing game, you hand it over to a GM and they make their own version of it. Which means that playtesting feedback I sort of divide into two types. There's bits sort of point out mistakes, like the sniper rifle can't kill someone if you shoot in the head. This sniper will do more damage, or thieves always can't backstab. Fine, that needs to be fixed. But a lot of other feedback you can sort of take directly. Like if someone says, "Oh, combat is way too slow," if one person says that, you can't, so you should run off and go, sorry, try to use the combat system, because that might be the GM just being very, very slow, and like 5 other groups might go, it ran fine. So you basically need to place them with lots of groups, and then sort of look for common patterns as opposed to individual bits of action or feedback. Like you won't often like be able to sort of sit down and go, here are things you need to fix. You need to get all the feedback, process it, find the bits which are copied up in multiple groups as being problems or as being needs to be polished, and then work on those. That or we need to invent sort of like a spherical frictionless GM, which would give the same result for all groups.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. You know, there's the stuff that you see as interpretive, and you know, if this could be an issue with any game that you put in front of someone, then maybe disregard or minimize that in comparison to things that are really core to what your game is and what your mechanics are. Are they actually working? Are they getting the thing out of it that you intended? I suppose that goes back to Steffi's point of, you know, setting out some kind of expectations for maybe some people, and then for others just saying kind of, you know, kind or if, say, with Romance of the Perilous Land, I wanted it to be a game that was kind of going to be someone's potential first game. So is this clear enough if I gave it to someone who had literally never played a role-playing game in their life, or even that they never even wanted to? But if I said, okay, could you create a character here, for example, then I think I tend to get quite nice feedback off the back of that, some very specific things like that, very specific audiences.
I think the only thing I can chime in on that is that you shouldn't be you need to be prepared to be have your ego bruised a lot. I think that's the only thing I can say when it comes to playtesting. I remember getting the playtest feedback from the first couple of rounds of Doctor Who, and there was the that's it. No, I'm never writing again. Tip the table over and just storming off. But it wasn't. I really, you have to kind of get over that and get used to the idea that there's going to be people who don't like what you do.
I have a question for I guess everyone, because I've not worked on a licensed game before, but it seems everyone else has. So when it comes to playtesting a licensed game, do you think there's a kind of a double expectation there? There's the expectation that a game should work in a certain way, that a game should work, but also that the license works to that individual, that fan. You know, if you're getting playtesters to playtest a licensed product, do you get, here's a group of diehard fans of that series, here's a group of people who are casual watchers or readers or whatever, and does that change things?
They're going to give much longer playtest reports.
Yes. I have very fond memories of being. I was one of the playtesters for Farscape when that came out as an RPG, and I have this strange memory of them sending us all the files, and then there was this message group that was going on, and they got barraged with absolutely thousands of messages from us hardcore Farscape fans going, no, this isn't how Farscape works. You're using D20. There was no feedback from them at all. They just kind of disappeared, and then came back 6 months later, and they'd taken everything on board and done all the tweaks. It's just they just didn't tell us that they'd done it. They just kind of had this massive information, and then just from really hardcore Farscape fans who were like, oh no, they have to be able to, like Dargo, you know, you have to until the blood runs clear and stuff like that, otherwise they're going to die from a system shock and things like that. And yeah, I think it helped having hardcore fans on, but yes, they did. I think they were a bit overwhelmed by it all.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much for that. So I suppose moving on a little bit, the next thing I was kind of really wondering about is obviously design and development of games is quite a creative process, but as I think Steffi had mentioned before about, eventually you have to get the product out there. So that kind of brings me on the idea of deadlines. So when you have things like deadlines, how do you then go about balancing that deadline with creativity? How do those two come together, or does it cause conflict at times? What's your experiences of that?
Like how everyone's face just flashed into PTSD for a moment there as you
Yeah.
said deadlines.
Yeah.
All the deadlines we've all got suddenly flashed in front of our minds
Yeah.
there, and all
Yeah.
the past ones.
I was going, oh yeah, I've got one. I've got a couple.
Mm.
No, I will. Obviously, right now the world is crazy, and most people don't do this for a full-time job. So, so if a freelancer DMs me and is like, I can't meet my deadline because insert life, I'm usually like, yeah, that's fine. But I will say that one of the things that you pay me for is to create content that matches with your system and create it within the deadline that we agreed upon. And I have found, because it's largely freelancers, that everyone is very understanding when you explain to them, like, yeah, so there's a global lockdown and my kids are home from school, which and people are understanding. But in general, under normal circumstances, if life doesn't kick you in the face, meeting your deadline is part of what people pay you for. I'm just going to be real honest there.
I mean, the single best trait in a freelancer isn't getting stuck in on time or creativity or professionalism. It is just sending an email to the developer going, I will be late.
Yes. Oh my God.
I mean,
It's fine if you're late, but let us know. Yeah.
The other thing is, you need to basically, this is probably part of the craft, is just managing your process in terms of knowing, like, when you have to have stuff written. Like, it's great to have a fantastic idea on the day before a deadline. But if that is going to basically screw up the entire production process, then you say, write the idea down, use it for something else, or talk to the developer and say, like, I just had a great idea, can we fit this in somewhere? You need to basically, if you have a deadline, you need to have the stuff done for the deadline. And creativity sometimes has to take a step back from that. So yeah,
And most companies have a red line process. So you hand in your first draft, and then you get red lines, and then you hand in your second draft, and it's perfectly fine to hand in. A couple of months ago, I sent in a deadline. I sent in my work, my first draft for the deadline. I was like, yeah, I don't think this is my best work, but also the world is on fire, so I will fix it in red lines. Like, maybe not do that if it's the very first time you work with a developer, but this happened to be a developer who knows me and knows the quality of my work, and she was like, yeah, I get it, it's fine, you'll probably nail it on the second pass, it's okay. But sometimes an imperfect but on time and edited, please, edited first draft is better than a perfect first draft that comes in a month late.
I definitely feel like there's probably like an entire roundtable 3-hour discussion worth on just maintaining quality creativity on a budget and with a deadline, because it's at the end of the day you're creating art, and art is not always a constant steady stream that just pours out of someone's mind unfettered. It's a living thing that can be disrupted by things in your life or things in the world or any number of various different aspects and things that can interact in your life and screw with your creativity. There's so much we could chat about, but I definitely do think agreeing that at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, communication and just knowing that it's not just your work. And this is maybe just coming from a bit of producer history in my brain, but the number of times you have a person who'll slam something onto the deadline, so it's midnight on the deadline, and the email hits your inbox and the work is complete, and you're like, great, thanks, I have no slide for this now. Like, it's very rare that your work is the last thing in the chain. So if you slam something into your email, your client's email box at like midnight, someone else is now more likely to be late because you've not given them any breathing room. And that's how projects can start to snowball. So if you're a couple of days late, then someone else is going to be a couple of days late. And then if that person has a family problem or something, and then that's and that's just how these things horribly snowball. So just that sort of awareness, especially in commercial, I was going to say commercial fiction, but like in commercial like projects and writing and stuff, you're rarely the sole person in there. So hitting your deadlines isn't just about you, as I guess the only thing I would probably add on top of what has been said by others so far.
I'd kind of chime in there with the continuing that with the projects that are just you, because at the same time as writing the stuff for people like Cubicle 7 and Eden, I've been working on Wild for myself, and because it doesn't have a deadline, that's why it's taken 8 years. And I'm still not finished. I keep looking at it going, it's not perfect. How is it not perfect? And yeah, so yeah, you really could do with giving yourself a deadline as well sometimes if you're working by yourself.
Yeah, that's actually why the 12 games in 12 months was so great, because at one point we started to write longer and longer games, and eventually like, we've got to stop. We don't have the time for this. We don't get paid enough for this. It's good. Just finish it. It's good. It's done. It's over. It's gone. And that was actually really good to just go like, we're going to write a game a month. It's not going to be perfect because I only had 30 days to write it, but here it is. It's done. And yeah, I actually like I've mentioned We Die here before, but I actually like that one enough that I'm now looking into making it into a full game. So you can absolutely use those smaller self-imposed deadlines to make a longer thing out of it.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that. And I suppose I should probably apologise if anybody's diaries have just flashed before their eyes, the sea of deadlines and dread. So, moving on to my next question. One of the things that's really been observed over the past few years, although they've been around for some time, is that there's been a growth in the one-page RPGs that have been kind of kicking around. Do you think that there's a particular reason for this? Is there a current trend or audience, do you think, maybe potentially looking for something a little lighter mechanically? Or do you think it's because it gives designers a good opportunity to really flex their muscles, as it were, to really rise to the challenge of designing something with such simplicity such simplicity that is a one-page RPG?
I mean, I guess for me, it's sort of both, really. I said at the start of this, I really like to challenge myself, and that could be something that's just really wild. Can I fit all of this on a single sheet of paper? Make sure it actually works mechanically, make sure that it reads well, make sure it's completely playable. That's kind of a very, I guess, an egotistical way of looking at a challenge to myself, but I guess it's also what is the design philosophy behind that. I think more and more people, and you'll see this certainly on Twitter, you can see a lot of things on Twitter, more and more people decrying kind of the 400-page books, and more people wanting sub 100 pages. Now that's really horses for courses, isn't it? With a 400-page book, you could get an absolute ton in there, some great setting material, full bestiary, and all the mechanics that you need to play campaigns for years. But at the same time, you could potentially get that on a one pager. You just might be expecting something slightly different from, I guess, either the playstyle or from people might be expecting different from one-page RPG that they for a 400-page RPG, probably quite obviously. But I do enjoy making not necessarily just one-page RPGs, but fairly small, kind of 24-page zines and things like that, because one, it is a challenge, and two, because people who are generally quite experienced just like to pick that up. People tend to be fairly time poor. I think probably maybe at the moment. So it's something that they can kind of read through and get playing as soon as possible. But yeah.
Yeah, I do suspect that Twitter is a major part of the growth, just because it is something you can sort of go, oh, click, I read that now, as opposed to a giant RPG. But I mean, it also has sort of echoes of the sort of creativity through constraints, like the Oulipo movement, whatever it is in literature, where basically people are trying to write books with bizarre constraints, there's one novel out there which doesn't use the letter E at any point in it. And certainly for role-playing games, can you sort of fit your ideas down and sort of compress them and bend them so they do fit on a single piece of paper? That can sort of spark some interesting, any constraints can sort of spark interesting creative thoughts.
I also think that the one-page games, or the 2, 3, 4-page games, allow you to quickly capture inspiration. Like a friend of mine, Chapman, wrote a game about 32 hogs. Remember that the farmer that 32 feral hogs. And then Liz and I wrote a game about the song festival, because we're both really big Eurovision fans, and obviously we watched the Netflix movie. And we're like, yep, that's basically a documentary. We should make a game. So I think the smaller games just allow people to really quickly go, oh yeah, that should be a game, and then you can write it. And what helps, of course, is that between drive-through RPG and itch.io, you can then actually get it to an audience. So you're not just writing into the void, that you're getting some feedback on it, and you might make like a couple of dollars. And I think that encourages people to just go like, I've got this really big assignment, and I'm also going to do a one-page game in the next hour or two.
I feel like I could only really, because I've not written like one page or anything like small like that myself, so I'm coming at it entirely from like a customer, but I do absolutely love small games. Like I'm constantly on like itch and everything, and like the racial justice bundle was like not only for a good cause, but had so many amazing like small games in there that I'm still going through and still reading them and everything. So for me, from someone who's just like quite into them and buying them, I know I'm buying more than I will ever play, but I just love to be steeped in the creativity and the heart. Anytime someone sits down to make something, whether it's a 500-page massive thing or just a small one page, you're getting a small part of that person's life and their like soul, and I love just sort of experiencing all those things. And more and more nowadays, everything's constantly vying for your attention. Algorithms are trying to keep us on websites for longer and longer, and YouTube wants you to sit in front of a screen watching chaining videos over and over again for hours and hours on end, and Netflix binge watching, and everything is constantly vying for your attention and trying to hold you there for as long as possible. So when you have something as nice and contained and neat as like a nice little one-page adventure, and you can sit down, you can read it, and you can say, I know how to do something cool and different now. And if I find myself in a bar in like 5 years' time, and my friends and I are all sitting around, like, and we've got like an hour to kill, or you're in an airport and you've got like a couple hours to kill waiting for a connecting flight, you can be like, hey, who wants to play Everyone is John? or like Lasers and Feelings or something. It feels very enriching in that way for me personally. And like Steffi's saying, from a creator standpoint, I imagine it must be wonderfully liberating to be able to just do that. Like I've written so many weird homebrews for Savage Worlds or 5th edition or something, and they just sit in my Google Drive collecting digital dust for the decades and things like that. And it's great that nowadays, if you want to, as like a designer, you can cut your teeth on these small projects. It's like they say with a lot of fiction writing and things like that as well, is don't try to write a novel for your first thing, because those things take a lot of time and you can learn a lot faster with a lot smaller projects. So just do a bunch of small things and you'll learn, you'll make your mistakes and you get them over with, rather than trying to sit down and write your 500-page magnum opus when you're just starting out. Speaking as someone who literally tried to sit down and write a novel as the first writing thing I'd ever done, let me tell you, it wasn't good and it hasn't gone anywhere. But my short stories, I've done a bunch of those, and they're also not gone anywhere, but I've done more.
That was a great. My short stories, also no.
Also not gone anywhere. But I feel like I've done more. I've completed projects.
Yes, I was hoping for got published in like some Hugo award-winning magazine.
Never give up hope.
Yeah,
but everything's a work in progress until it's not.
It is, yeah, until it's out. And even then, I mean, if it's a digital product, like I've got itch games, I've got one in the racial bundle about making soup, and I got feedback on it from somebody who made a suggestion. I was like, yes, that's brilliant. The next time I do an update on this game, I'm just going to use your suggestion. But yeah, so digital games I've never done.
Gotta love some of the creativity as well. I mean, there's the Dune one that's been doing the rounds on Twitter at the moment, which is great because one of the stats is Oscar Isaac, and now all I keep thinking is why don't all games have an Oscar Isaac stat? And it's like maybe next time when we're playing Star Wars, we should change one of the official FFG ones so that one of the stats is Oscar Isaac. What happens when you roll a triumph?
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Moving on, we're kind of coming close to a close now. One of the big questions I was going to leave until last was that within the hobby of RPGs, obviously there's quite a lot of tropes that are used both mechanically and from a literary perspective. When you're designing something new, how hard is it to avoid mirroring other games? Or do you feel maybe perhaps that it's something that you would maybe even lean into and then look for ways to riff or move away from it?
I mean, RPGs are sort of inherently weird in that they're an art form, but they're from that doesn't have one person can't experience an RPG. An RPG has to be experienced by at least two people for most games. That are really except 1,000-Year Vampire person, but for the vast majority of them, it's one GM, 2 to 6 players. Session has to last 3 hours or 3 or 4 hours. Everyone has to have roughly equal spotlight time. Everyone has their own character. So structurally, vast majority of RPGs do resemble each other. So it's hard to avoid mirroring other stuff because, in the same way that pretty much every movie has to have people on screen talking. It's inherent in the. So what I find you just work out what new thing you're trying to say if you are trying to say a new thing, and sort of state that and find your one little tweak, your one little sort of addition to the ongoing conversation, and state that as opposed to trying to reinvent things from scratch.
Yeah, from my perspective, tropes in general, regardless of the media or whatever you're using them for, they're just like parts of a sort of cultural language most of the time. Sometimes depends again, obviously, the culture that you're drawing the tropes from. Tropes are not always everything. But they're essentially sort of like time saving. The only time that tropes become a real problem is if your like final experience or product or whatever you want to call it is nothing but tropes. You can use tropes as a good sort of common language to save time. Like, okay, we're rolling to hit. And most people who play various games or whatever, if it's a combat focused game or whatever, they know, okay, my character is going to attempt to walk up and hit the person now or whatever. So it's fine to use tropes as long as they're not like the sole focus of your game. They're good time saving measures in my eyes. But if you want your game to be saying something different, maybe you want your game just to be super tropey. Maybe you want to just create like a universal system that lets you do something that everyone's done, you know, that's perfectly fine. Or maybe you want to subvert tropes. Maybe you want to have not a single trope in your system, and that's also fine. But it's tropes are like part of a toolbox in my eyes, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the tropes exist for a reason. People do resonate with tropes, so you know, you could put the kind of the Tolkien fantasy out there, and you know that's done to death, but people like it, you know, for a reason. So, as you say, you know, you might want to look to subvert those tropes. You might want to put in some new kind of mechanic or a twist on that. But as you say, Len, it is you can be as tropey as you want. I think going back to the kind of one-page RPGs, what I found is actually tropes really help with that common language. If you have say a bestiary that's literally a column long, you don't have space for description in there. But if I put the word griffin or Yog-Sothoth in there, generally there is that shared language there that it needs no more description. People automatically know what that is, so it can work depending on what you want to get from that game.
I think a good example is games, like you're saying there. If you don't need to explain what a sword is to most people, despite the fact that swords and sorcery is a trope.
That's brilliant. Thanks for those who've been involved with that. I suppose kind of brilliant talking to everybody. So just thinking about wrapping up and bringing things to a close. So one final question that I had, just for instance, things up was which game designers have really shaped your design approaches? And are there any designers out there that you would consider are currently in the ones to watch category? If you'd like to give them a little bit of a shout out, we would include them in the video description for this today.
I guess for my own personal bits and pieces, I mentioned earlier, but Avery Adler. I read Monster Hearts when I was just starting to get like really quite heavily back into role-playing games again. And this was coming from, I was working in the video games industry at the time, and everybody around me just wanted to play 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons because it had not long launched. But it was either that or Vampire the Masquerade. And both are great systems, but I wanted something that was maybe a bit lighter, a bit more streamlined, didn't necessarily have as much hacking and slashing, or like heavy horror themes. And I came upon Monster Hearts, and that sort of showed me, oh, here's a small lightweight system where people have these booklets. You can literally like print off these like I guess leaning on tropes again. Like it's these trope laden, this common language of teen like monster shows like Buffy and all those sorts of things that you can. But it's a very nice lightweight system that's all about social interactions, and it was so very different from anything I had read before that it sort of like twinged me on like, oh wow, you can really tell stories that are not not just about people rocking into dungeons and killing things, or shadow intrigue in urban fantasy and things like that. You can tell these like weird, interesting, different stories. So that's kind of shaped definitely my love of smaller indie things, and I feel like I carry a lot of that as I'm going about working on like larger projects and things like that. So that'd probably be my sort of both, yeah, for a designer that got me going, and one to watch, I guess, because they're still making good stuff.
I mean, so I do a lot of stuff with Gumshoe, which is by Robin D. Laws, and Robin is an amazingly thoughtful designer and has like put a lot of effort into sort of the underlying philosophy and sort of dramaturgy of role-playing games. So I mean, he's always sort of like looking for to do innovative stuff. Like I mean, his Armitage Files, which is an adventure called Cthulhu, or Trail of Cthulhu even, was one of those innovative bits of adventure design technology in the last couple of years, and it's definitely worth looking at. In terms of sort of ones to watch, people, I mean, this is again nepotistic or possibly incestuous, but John Hodgson, who works a lot, and his Handiwork Games, and they're Beowulf and so forth. And John is he's one of the people like Kevin Crawford people who's sort of a multi-level threat in that he can write, he's a fantastic artist, and he has a very good business brain. So you know that once he gets teeth into a project, it's going to get moving very, very quickly. So sort of keep an eye on what he comes up with there.
I like a lot of people, but I'll narrow it down to three. One is Jenna, and I forget her last name. I want to say Jenna Moran, but I don't know if that's it. She wrote the Fae for Exalted, and recently she did this game called Glitch, and her stuff is always very weird and surreal and evocative and intense, and I love that. I also love Rose Bailey. She has a Patreon, and Rose has a lot of games always in the work, like. And she has very easy pick up the dice play mechanics, which I love. And the third would be Liz, of course, Elizabeth Tripredical. She recently won an award with Afterlife Wandering Souls. And then for the anthology, she did like weird stuff. Like we have a unicorn game, and the mechanics is coloring pages. And we have a bloody demon slay, and your stats are menstrual states. So it's like flow and viscosity and mood for your stats. And you sit around discussing what kind of menstruation your demon slayer is going through. And I kind of love that.
Sorry, I was going to mention Jenna Moran as well, because I honestly don't know how she manages to produce so much stuff. It's just like so the massive tomes that come out constantly. I was going to mention Thomas Harenstam and Nils Carlin from Free League, because I love Tales from the Loop, and has really shaped what I think rules should be, and how they've managed to boil down everything to about, I think Tales from the Loop's about 12 pages of rules in a gorgeous book, but it's after all these years of playing older games where the rules are like 90 odd pages, managing to boil it down. And then also Grant Howitt, probably need to mention because of his one-page adventures, especially Jason Statham's Big Vacation, which is a work of genius. One to watch, I'll probably be a little bit nepotistic and mention Stu Goff, who is helping to publish Wild later this year. Fingers crossed if I can actually finish the damn thing. He brought out a couple of games over the last year, one called Aegean, which is all Greek mythology, which was awesome. And his first Kickstarter was part of the Zine Quest thing earlier this year or end of last year, where he did one called the Gaslight Club, where you all play robot hosts in a theme park like Westworld, gradually becoming self-aware, set in like a theme park version of the 1920s New York. And that was great as well. So yeah, I'm hoping there's going to be more good stuff from him soon.
For me, a big inspiration has been Simon Washburn of Beyond Belief Games. I found him quite a few years ago, but he was creating games that were set around the famous Five and the Secret Seven, lashings of ginger beer, and a game Watership Down where you like rabbits and hedgehogs, but not like anthropomorphic ones that, well, I guess anthropomorphized, but not wearing hats and suits of armor. They're just hedgehogs, which I really liked, and it kind of showed me, okay, well, there are things beyond, I guess, these big flagship games, and you can be very playful with these games. I think S. John Ross as well, in terms of Rises. Again, something I think was very much at the forefront of very rules light games that were evocative and super mechanically sound. You can just pull out on a night that you've completely forgot to prep anything. I think in terms of people to watch, Chris Brissett, I think that's how you say his surname. Sorry, Chris. He's just got a really great Kickstarter going for The Wretched, a kind of second printing and really nice solo game that's done really well. Daniel Sell, who worked on Troika and does a lot in terms of publishing under his imprint as well, and the folks behind Merkberg, which the names escape me, unfortunately. But they've done a fantastic job in terms of both design, aesthetic, but creating a super evocative thematic game.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much to all of you for being involved in the AlbaCon 2020 game design panel. It's been really informative and really insightful into your experiences with game design and development. For our viewers, can you all give us a little bit of a shout out just where they might be able to find you in social media and other areas? That'd be great. Thank you.
So the quickest way to find me is on Twitter as 100 Things I Love. 100 is the number, and then Things I Love. And my pinned post is a link tree, and it will take you to my website and my itch games and my Patreon. So just go to Twitter, and then you can take it from there.
I'm on Twitter as Mytholder, or garhanrahan.com. Links to everything.
I'm just very boringly at Elaine Lithgow on Twitter. I don't know if you'll be able to find it though. I'm very obfuscated behind layers and layers of firewalls and false identities. If you want to follow the things I do in my spare time, so obviously I'm working at Cubicle 7 as a staff writer. They're at Cubicle 7, I believe, just on Twitter. And my personal bits and pieces that I do is at Team Digisprite. So you can find me on Twitter somewhere rambling about something.
Well, for me, if you whisper the right words to a raven, it'll eventually find me. But other than that, you'll find me at Trosh Delver on Twitter, and that'll lead to all the other places that I'm at.
Well, if you search for autocratic, but don't have a C on the end, have a K instead, you'll find me on autocratic.com, which will take you to my blog where I talk about nonsense and also promote RPG a day. And I'm also autocratic on Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of thing as well.
massive thank you to all our guests. You've been brilliant, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have all of you. You've all given us, everyone, a lot of insight, and it's been wonderful to hear about your experiences. So, as a reminder, this video is for the online charity role-playing convention, AlbaCon. It's being held on the 3rd and 4th of October. All money raised will go to It's Good to Give, who provide amazing support to young cancer patients and their families. To find out more, go on to www.albacon.co.uk. And that's a big thank you from me, Ollie Peltier, and my co-host, Bob Donaldson.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.